The judge removed her glasses, leaned closer, and whispered, "Consider this your private sentencing." That moment changed everything. The day had an odd mix of warmth and formality. I stepped into the courthouse, the polished wooden floors echoing softly beneath my shoes. There was a faint scent of old leather, mingled with the crispness of freshly printed documents, and it set a strange kind of calm in my chest. Normally, a courtroom made me uneasy, the hushed conversations, the distant gavel strikes. But today, I couldn't stop noticing her. She sat behind the bench, the embodiment of quiet authority. The judge, a woman in her early 40s, with a presence that was both commanding and gentle. She adjusted her glasses slowly, the sunlight catching the rims, sending tiny reflections across the room. The motion was so deliberate, so unhurried, that it made me pause. Even in this formal setting, she carried herself with an effortless grace, the kind of elegance that didn't need to announce itself. When our eyes met for the first time, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't name. It wasn't desire in the shallow sense. It was awareness. She was looking at me as though she could see past my nervous posture, past my self-conscious attempts at composure, right to the part of me that usually stayed hidden. Her gaze held steady, and I noticed the quiet warmth in her eyes. Not just authority, but understanding. I had to remind myself to breathe normally. My pulse had picked up without warning. Every detail of her presence seemed amplified. The subtle way her hair fell over one shoulder, the gentle curve of her lips as she read a file, the soft sigh as she glanced at the docket. Even the rhythm of her pen scratching notes felt intimate in some strange, inexplicable way. I realized I was observing her more than the courtroom itself, and a part of me felt both foolish and entirely captivated. As the proceedings began, she spoke with a voice that was measured, calm, and unexpectedly soothing. There was no harshness, no condescension, only clarity and precision. Yet, under that professional tone, I sensed something more. The warmth of someone who had seen the human side of mistakes, someone who had learned patience through experience. Each word she spoke seemed to carry weight, not just of law, but of understanding. I tried to focus on my case, on the small legal matter that had brought me here, but her presence made it difficult. I caught myself glancing at her whenever I could, drawn to the subtle movements, a slight tilt of her head, the way she adjusted her glasses again, the brief, almost imperceptible smile she gave a colleague. It was as though the world had narrowed to the space she occupied, and I was both terrified and exhilarated by that narrowing. In that first moment, before any words were exchanged between us, an unspoken tension had begun to form. Not inappropriate, not urgent, just magnetic. A slow, steady pull, like the first hint of warmth after a long winter. And though I didn't yet understand what it meant, I knew this encounter would linger in me long after the courtroom emptied. Something about her, her calm authority, her quiet confidence, her subtle, graceful presence, had already unsettled me in the best possible way. The courtroom hummed with quiet energy, the low murmur of people moving papers, shuffling feet, and distant voices forming a soft background to my racing thoughts. I tried to focus on the case in front of me, yet I couldn't help but steal glances at her, the judge. She was poised behind the bench, every movement deliberate and precise, yet there was a softness to the way she conducted herself that drew my attention like a magnet. Her hands moved gracefully over the papers before her. She flipped a page with a quiet flick, and for a moment, our fingers almost touched as I reached for my own documents. A strange warmth shot through me at the near contact, and I felt a self-conscious flush creep up my neck. There was a rhythm to her actions that seemed almost hypnotic, the careful tilt of her head as she read, the subtle way she tapped her pen against the desk, not impatiently, but as if each tap was a thought taking form. Every so often, her eyes would lift from the papers, scanning the courtroom with a mixture of attention and thoughtfulness. And sometimes, just sometimes, they landed on me. In those moments, my chest tightened slightly, and the world around us seemed to blur, leaving only the quiet intensity of her gaze. It wasn't flirtation, it was recognition, a silent acknowledgement of my presence, and perhaps, of something unspoken that neither of us fully understood yet. I found myself noticing other small details. The way her hair caught the light near the window, shimmering subtly as she shifted her head. The faint scent of her perfume, soft, floral, and lingering just enough to brush against my senses as the room's air carried it toward me. Her voice, when she spoke to me or a colleague, had a warmth to it that contrasted with the authority in her tone. It commanded respect, yes, but also invited a quiet trust. During a procedural pause, she glanced in my direction and offered a brief, knowing smile. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet it sent a jolt through me that left my thoughts scattered. I forced myself to focus on the docket, the legal forms, the case at hand, but her presence made concentration nearly impossible. Each subtle movement she made seemed to speak louder than the words themselves, a tilt of her shoulder, the careful placement of her hands, a slight arch of her eyebrow, all conveying a composed elegance that fascinated me. I became painfully aware of my own nervous energy. My fingers fidgeted with the edge of my paperwork, my legs bounced slightly under the bench, and yet, despite the anxiety, there was a strange exhilaration in being observed, and more importantly, being understood by someone so perceptive, so quietly commanding. The age difference between us lingered in my mind, a subtle caution against letting myself get too carried away, yet her presence made that warning feel both distant and irrelevant. In that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just here to deal with legal matters. I was here to witness her confidence, her quiet authority, her humanity. And in doing so, I was discovering a connection that defied the boundaries of courtroom formality. The slow burn of fascination had begun, delicate and unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. The courtroom emptied faster than I expected, leaving behind only the soft echo of footsteps and the faint scent of polished wood. My case had been concluded, technically, but she called me back, a quiet summons that made my pulse quicken. "Step aside for a moment," she said, her voice low but steady, carrying a calm authority that left no room for protest. There was a pause as she met my eyes, and in that brief moment, the familiar professional distance seemed to soften. Something unspoken lingered between us, a subtle tension that both startled and intrigued me. I nodded, feeling strangely exposed yet compelled to follow her lead. The hallway was quiet, almost empty, the usual bustle of the courthouse reduced to a soft murmur in the distance. The lighting cast long, golden shadows along the walls, and for a moment, it felt as if the world outside had slipped away. The air smelled faintly of paper and the faint trace of her perfume, a warm floral note that clung to the space she moved through. Every step closer to her bench sent a ripple of nervous anticipation through me. She removed her glasses with deliberate care, setting them down on the desk. The gesture was simple, almost mundane, yet somehow it commanded my full attention. Without the lenses, her eyes seemed larger, softer, more direct, a window into the quiet depth of her character. I noticed the faint crease near her temple as she focused, a mark of thoughtfulness that made her human, approachable, real. "Consider this your private sentencing," she said, her tone playful but tinged with seriousness, and I felt my chest tighten at the words. There was no humorless authority here, only the careful balance of guidance, warmth, and subtle intrigue. She gestured for me to step closer, and as I did, her hand brushed lightly against my arm. The contact was brief, casual, almost accidental, yet it left a spark that lingered far longer than I expected. The proximity was disarming. I could see the texture of her blouse, the soft waves of her hair falling over her shoulder, the calm steadiness of her posture. I was painfully aware of how close we were, of how every small movement carried weight. My mind raced with questions, caution, and something else, an undeniable fascination that I could not name. We were no longer just judge and defendant. For this fleeting moment, the space between us was intimate, charged with quiet possibility. I caught her glance lingering on me, her eyes curious, perhaps assessing, perhaps acknowledging the tension that hummed in the air. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but words felt clumsy. Instead, I focused on the subtle signals, the soft tilt of her head, the brief touch, the gentle warmth in her expression. I realized then that this private moment was not about punishment. It was about connection, guidance, and trust. The formal boundaries of the courtroom no longer applied, and I was acutely aware that I was treading a line I hadn't expected to approach. The slow burn of fascination that had begun in the courtroom now intensified, delicate yet impossible to ignore. Every glance, every subtle gesture, every shared pause was a language I was only beginning to understand. And in that quiet hallway, under the soft glow of the courthouse lights, I felt the unmistakable pull of something entirely new, a connection that neither of us could yet define, but one that promised to change everything. The hallway felt quieter than ever, as if the courthouse itself had paused to watch this private encounter unfold. We stood near her bench, yet it didn't feel like the courtroom anymore. The polished wood, the faint smell of old paper, the distant echoes, all of it had faded into the background, leaving only her presence and the pull of something I could neither name nor resist. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a calm warmth that seemed to settle into the corners of my mind. "Responsibility isn't just about rules," she said. "It's about understanding people, seeing them, even when they make mistakes." The words weren't a lecture. They were an invitation, a quiet window into her perspective on life and the world she navigated every day. I found myself leaning in, drawn by the sincerity behind each syllable. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if it was proper to speak so openly. But something about her gaze, steady, patient, unjudging, encouraged honesty. I've always struggled with that," I admitted, my voice low. "I try to do the right thing, but sometimes it's harder than it looks. And I think I'm not always seen for who I really am." She nodded slowly, a subtle tilt of her head that made her hair catch the light in soft strands. Her eyes softened, and in them, I saw a reflection of understanding, the rare, comforting kind that makes you feel as though someone has peered into the quiet corners of your mind and recognized the truth there. "It's easy to get lost in what people expect from you," she said. "It's harder to stay honest with yourself. But that's what matters most." Her words felt like a warm hand on my shoulder, even though she wasn't touching me. And then she did, lightly, brushing my forearm with a casual grace that sent a jolt through me. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it lingered, leaving an imprint of warmth and connection that I couldn't ignore. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I simply breathed, trying to steady myself against the swirl of emotion rising inside me. I found myself revealing more than I had intended. My fears, my self-doubt, the awkward mistakes that I usually hid from the world, all spilled out in the quiet intimacy of that hallway. And she listened, not with judgment, but with genuine attention, leaning slightly forward, her posture relaxed but engaged. The steady rhythm of her breathing, the subtle warmth of her presence, the careful attentiveness in her gestures, it all made the confession easier than I could have imagined. There was a strange beauty in the moment, the power dynamic of judge and defendant suspended, replaced by two people sharing a fragile, delicate honesty. I was aware of the age difference, the societal expectations, the invisible lines we weren't supposed to cross. Yet in her presence, those boundaries softened, replaced by a mutual understanding that transcended protocol. By the time our exchange ended, something had shifted between us. The tension in the hallway was no longer merely curiosity or attraction, it was trust. An unspoken promise that, for this fleeting moment, we had seen each other clearly, not as roles or titles, but as humans navigating a complicated, sometimes unforgiving world. And in that shared recognition, the slow burn of connection deepened, pulling us both further into uncharted territory. After our private exchange in the hallway, the courthouse felt different. The echoes of footsteps and murmured conversations no longer registered in the same way. My attention had narrowed to her. She had returned her calm authority to the surface, yet beneath it, there was something more, a flicker of personal warmth, a hint of humor in the corner of her eyes that made her feel unexpectedly human. As she spoke, the conversation drifted from the strict legal matters to broader observations, small, seemingly inconsequential remarks that revealed layers of her personality. "Most people only see the gavel," she said with a slight smile. "But it's what comes before and after that counts." Her voice carried a quiet playfulness, and I realized she wasn't just speaking about the courtroom. She was speaking about life. I laughed softly, surprised at how easy it felt. I hadn't expected this openness, this subtle shift from authority to approachability. Her eyes softened as she noticed, and for a fleeting moment, her gaze lingered in a way that suggested curiosity, perhaps even quiet delight. There was a subtle magnetic pull in that attention, something I had never encountered before in my life. We spoke of small things, the rhythm of a courthouse day, the intricacies of the work that went unnoticed, even favorite books and music that no one would expect her to enjoy. Each revelation built a fragile bridge of trust between us, making the professional distance fade imperceptibly. The slow, careful unfolding of her personality fascinated me. The woman behind the robe was witty, insightful, and quietly vulnerable, qualities that made her presence all the more captivating. The physical space between us remained intimate, yet respectful. Our chairs, positioned close for the discussion, allowed our shoulders to almost brush when we leaned forward. Every subtle movement carried meaning. The gentle tilt of her head as she listened, the brief touch of her fingers on a paper as she emphasized a point, the soft shift of her weight toward me as though inviting engagement. These small gestures communicated something words could not: attentiveness, care, and the beginnings of unspoken connection. I became acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her presence. It was not just physical, though the light brush of her hand against mine sent jolts of awareness through me. It was emotional, a deep, steady warmth that resonated with the quiet parts of myself I often kept hidden. She had a way of making me feel both seen and understood, and the sensation was intoxicating. The slow burn of tension was no longer merely curiosity. It was a shared recognition. We were two people navigating the edges of an unspoken connection, aware of the boundaries, but gently exploring them through conversation, glances, and small, meaningful gestures. The experience was mesmerizing, a delicate dance of intellect and emotion, attraction and restraint. By the time our private discussion drew to a close, I realized I had glimpsed a side of her few ever did. Not just the authority, not just the judge, but the woman beneath. Patient, thoughtful, playful, quietly compelling. The connection we had begun to build in that hallway, subtle and unspoken, had deepened. I left that moment with a sense of wonder, anticipation, and a quiet certainty that this slow burn was far from over. The soft hum of the courthouse around us faded into near silence, leaving only the quiet space between her and me. By now, the initial curiosity and cautious fascination had evolved into something deeper, a slow, simmering intensity neither of us could ignore. Every subtle movement, every glance, carried a weight I felt in my chest. The private moment we shared had grown into an unspoken acknowledgement of something rare, a connection that transcended titles, age, and expectation. She leaned slightly forward, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk. As I shifted, our fingers brushed ever so gently. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it left a spark that seemed to linger in the space between us. I became acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her, a presence both calming and thrilling. The soft glow of the late afternoon sun streamed through the blinds, casting delicate stripes across her face and highlighting the subtle curves of her expression, the quiet authority softened by an approachable warmth. "Life isn't always about punishment," she said, her voice calm but imbued with a quiet sincerity. "Sometimes it's about guidance, about helping someone see the best in themselves, even when they struggle to see it." Her words weren't merely professional advice. They carried an emotional resonance that touched something deep within me. I realized that this private session was no longer about the case, or even about me in isolation. It was about trust, understanding, and emotional honesty. I found myself leaning in slightly, drawn not just by curiosity, but by the quiet intimacy of her presence. There was a magnetic tension in the room, subtle yet undeniable. Her gaze met mine, steady and probing, as though she were measuring not my mistakes, but my heart. Every subtle shift of her posture, every quiet gesture, communicated care, attentiveness, and something more, the unspoken possibility of connection. It was impossible to ignore the impact she had on me. The gentle brush of her fingers against mine, the soft cadence of her words, the way her eyes softened when she listened. All of it created a rhythm that felt both intimate and profoundly safe. My chest tightened with awareness, my thoughts momentarily suspended in the gravity of the moment. I understood, without her saying it outright, that this interaction mattered to her as much as it did to me. Time seemed to stretch, every second drawn out by the quiet intensity of our shared space. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, yet words felt inadequate. Instead, I allowed the moment to exist as it was, a delicate, charged connection that neither demanded explanation nor resolution. The emotional tension was palpable, yet gentle, like a slow current beneath a calm surface. When she finally shifted back, returning her hand to her side and adjusting her glasses with deliberate grace, there was a quiet acknowledgement in her expression, a promise of understanding, of connection preserved without overstepping boundaries. I left that space with my heart full, aware that something significant had passed between us, unspoken yet undeniable. The slow burn had reached its peak, and though nothing was declared aloud, both of us knew the world had shifted, subtly, irrevocably, in that quiet, sunlit hallway. The courthouse had quieted, the buzz of the day fading into soft echoes of footsteps and distant voices. The formalities of the courtroom were behind us now, and in that private space, the world seemed to shrink to just her and me. I felt the lingering weight of everything that had passed in the hallway, the subtle touches, the shared confidences, the unspoken understanding. Each moment had built on the last, slowly threading a connection that felt both fragile and profound. She returned her glasses with careful precision, the soft click of the frames against the desk echoing in the silence. For a moment, she looked at me with a quiet intensity, her eyes reflecting the same acknowledgement I had felt all along, that something significant had occurred between us, beyond the bounds of protocol, yet never crossing into impropriety. It was a gentle recognition of the bond we had begun to form, built on honesty, understanding, and subtle trust. Her hand brushed mine as she handed back a document, brief and fleeting, yet in that brief contact, I felt the warmth of everything unspoken. It wasn't a spark of passion, but something deeper, an emotional imprint, a sense of being truly seen. I noticed the way the sunlight caught her hair as she adjusted her glasses, the calm steadiness in her posture, and the softness in her expression that had only appeared in these private moments. "Remember," she said quietly, her voice steady but warm, "it's not just about the rules. It's about understanding yourself and the choices you make along the way." Her words, simple yet layered with meaning, resonated more deeply than any legal verdict could. I nodded, aware that she wasn't merely offering advice. She was offering trust, encouragement, and perhaps even a gentle invitation to continue seeing the world, and myself, differently. I stepped back, feeling the natural distance of professionalism return, yet the emotional connection lingered. There was a quiet satisfaction in that, a sense of completeness. The slow burn that had begun in the courtroom and deepened in the hallway didn't require overt gestures or declarations. It existed in the subtlety of shared glances, the warmth of fleeting touches, and the mutual recognition of vulnerability and humanity. Before leaving, our eyes met one last time. Her glance carried a gentle reassurance, a hint of curiosity, and a quiet acknowledgement that the bond we had shared would not fade simply because the courthouse walls resumed their authority. I felt an unexpected warmth settle in my chest, a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and lingering fascination. The age difference, the professional boundaries, all the social expectations, they were still there, but they felt less insurmountable, softened by the trust and intimacy we had nurtured carefully, moment by moment. As I walked away, I realized that the encounter had shifted something fundamental inside me. The nervousness that had greeted me upon entering the courthouse had transformed into a quiet confidence, a sense of being seen and understood by someone extraordinary. And though the moment had concluded, the connection remained, subtle, profound, and wholly unforgettable. It was a slow-burn intimacy, quiet yet enduring, leaving a warmth that lingered long after the courthouse doors closed behind me. If you felt the tension, the quiet moments, and the slow-burn connection in this story, hit like and subscribe for more age gap romance tales that explore emotional intimacy and subtle desire. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which moment between them captivated you the most? 41.